My name is Lauren, and I'm 32 years old. I was lying on a pristine beach in Maui with my husband Mark when my phone buzzed with an email that would change everything. The sender was Richard Thompson, my father-in-law and CEO of Thompson Industries. The subject line read simply, "Termination, effective immediately." After 5 years of building his mergers and acquisitions department from nothing, I was being fired while on my 5th wedding anniversary vacation. The reason given was corporate restructuring, but I knew the truth involved his new 28-year-old girlfriend, Sophia. Before I share how I turned his own boardroom against him, tell me where you're watching from. Please subscribe if you believe karma always finds its way, and let me take you through the most shocking betrayal and sweetest revenge of my life. 7 years ago, I met Mark Thompson at Harvard Business School. He was charming, brilliant, and came from a family that owned one of the largest manufacturing conglomerates in the Northeast. Our connection was instant, though I never imagined how complicated marrying into his family would become. When we graduated, I had competing offers from Goldman Sachs and McKinsey, but Mark convinced me to join Thompson Industries. His father, Richard, seemed thrilled to have me aboard, constantly praising my fresh perspective and calling me the daughter he never had. I threw myself into the work with everything I had. Starting with just myself and one assistant, I built the mergers and acquisitions department from scratch. Within 2 years, we were a team of 15, and by year 5, we had completed deals worth over $2 billion, generating nearly $500 million in pure profit for the company. Richard would parade me at board meetings, telling everyone how I was the future of Thompson Industries. He even hinted that when he retired, I would be his natural successor, not just because I was family, but because I had earned it. The Thompson family seemed perfect from the outside. Richard and his wife Margaret had been married for 35 years, raised 2 successful sons, and were fixtures in Connecticut society. Margaret treated me like her own daughter, sharing family recipes and stories about Mark's childhood. Sunday dinners at their estate were filled with laughter, business discussions, and plans for the future. Richard would often pull me aside to discuss strategy, valuing my input on everything from international expansion to new product lines. But 6 months ago, everything shifted. Richard announced he was divorcing Margaret, claiming they had grown apart. The real reason became clear when he showed up to the next board meeting with Sophia, a 28-year-old former model who he introduced as a consultant. Margaret was devastated, moving out of their 30-room mansion into a modest apartment in the city. Mark was furious with his father, but tried to stay neutral, believing his parents would eventually reconcile. Sophia immediately inserted herself into company operations. Despite having what she claimed was an MBA from a prestigious online program, her suggestions were consistently terrible. She pushed for investments in failing companies, wanted to fire our most experienced staff to bring in her friends, and spent more time planning corporate parties than understanding our financials. When I quietly investigated her credentials, I discovered her MBA was from an unaccredited online institution that had been shut down for fraud. The week before our anniversary vacation, Richard's behavior toward me changed dramatically. He started questioning every decision I made, criticizing presentations that he would have praised just months earlier. He excluded me from key meetings, saying Sophia would attend in my place to gain experience. When I closed a $40 million acquisition that I had been working on for 8 months, he barely acknowledged it, instead praising Sophia for her insight on a completely unrelated matter. Mark noticed the tension, but dismissed my concerns. He thought I was being paranoid, that his father was just going through a phase because of the divorce. Even when I showed him emails where Richard was giving Sophia credit for my work, Mark insisted I was misinterpreting things. He suggested the vacation would help me relax and gain perspective. How wrong we both were about what was really happening behind the scenes. I had meticulously planned our Hawaii trip for months, booking the same resort where we had honeymooned 5 years earlier. The first 2 days were perfect, filled with snorkeling, sunset dinners, and long walks on the beach. Mark and I reconnected away from the stress of work and family drama. We even talked about starting our own family soon, imagining teaching our future children to surf in these very waters. Then came that email on day 3. As I read it on my phone, my hands started shaking. Mark grabbed the device, his face going pale as he read the termination letter. It stated that due to corporate restructuring and performance concerns, my position was being eliminated immediately. My company accounts were already deactivated, and my personal belongings would be boxed and shipped to our home. After everything I had built, everything I had sacrificed, I was being discarded like yesterday's newspaper. Within an hour of receiving that email, my phone exploded with calls and messages. Jennifer, my assistant of 4 years, was crying as she told me security had already escorted her to pack my office. She whispered that Sophia had moved in before my chair was even cold, literally sitting at my desk and going through my files. Jennifer managed to take photos before being forced to leave, showing Sophia reading through my confidential client communications and private strategy documents. Mark immediately called his father, putting him on speaker so I could hear. Richard's voice was cold, emotionless, completely different from the man who had once called me daughter. When Mark demanded an explanation, Richard simply said that business is business and family is family, and the two should never be confused. He claimed my performance had been declining, that I had become too comfortable, too entitled. When Mark pressed him about Sophia taking my position, Richard said she had shown remarkable potential and deserved a chance to prove herself. The call ended with Mark shouting at his father, something I had never heard him do before. Richard hung up on his own son, leaving us both stunned on that beautiful beach paradise, suddenly feeling like a prison. Mark threw his phone into the sand, his face red with anger and confusion. He kept apologizing, saying he should have listened to me, should have seen what was happening. But apologies could not undo the betrayal or restore what had been stolen from me. That evening, Jennifer risked her own job to send me more information. She forwarded emails showing that Sophia had been meeting with my biggest clients for weeks, introducing herself as the new head of mergers and acquisitions. Jennifer also discovered that Richard had been slowly transferring my pending deals to Sophia's name in the system, making it appear as if she had been the one developing these relationships all along. The premeditation was staggering. The next morning brought another shock. James Morrison, CEO of Morrison Corp, our largest client worth over $200 million annually, sent me a personal email. He was confused and concerned about my sudden termination, especially since we were in the middle of negotiating a massive expansion of our partnership. He mentioned that Sophia had contacted him, but he found her completely incompetent and refused to work with her. He wanted to know what was really going on and whether he should reconsider his relationship with Thompson Industries. I spent hours on the phone with James, carefully explaining the situation without seeming vindictive. He was appalled by Richard's behavior and quietly mentioned that several other CEOs in his network had similar concerns about the recent changes at Thompson Industries. He promised to hold off on any decisions until things became clearer, but warned that he could not wait long. His board was already asking questions about the stability of their partnership with us. Mark spent that entire day trying to reach his mother, finally connecting with her late in the evening. Margaret was not surprised by my termination. She revealed something that made my blood run cold. Richard was not just replacing me at the company. He was in the process of transferring 30% of his personal shares to Sophia, effectively making her one of the largest individual shareholders. Margaret had learned this from her divorce attorney, who had discovered it while reviewing financial documents. This revelation changed everything. This was not just about a job or even about personal betrayal. This was about the future of Thompson Industries, a company that employed thousands of people and had been built by Mark's grandfather from nothing. If Sophia gained that much control combined with Richard's backing, she could destroy everything 3 generations had created. The stakes were suddenly much higher than my personal career. That night, unable to sleep, I reviewed my employment contract on my laptop. I had negotiated it carefully 5 years ago, including specific clauses about termination. One section stood out if I was terminated without cause after achieving specific performance metrics, which I had exceeded every single year. I was entitled to a formal review before the board of directors. Richard had apparently forgotten about this provision, or perhaps he assumed I would be too devastated to fight back. Mark found me at 3 a.m, still hunched over my computer, taking notes and formulating a plan. He sat beside me, finally fully understanding the scope of what his father had done. We talked until sunrise, and he promised to support whatever I decided to do. I made a choice that surprised him. Instead of cutting our vacation short and rushing back to Connecticut, I would stay in Hawaii for the remaining 4 days, using the time to carefully plan my response. Richard thought he had won by striking while I was away. He had no idea that distance would actually work to my advantage. The next morning, as Mark slept off the emotional exhaustion of the previous day, my phone rang with a Connecticut number I did not recognize. It was Harold Watson, the Chief Financial Officer of Thompson Industries and one of the most respected executives in the company. Harold had worked with Mark's grandfather and had seen the company through decades of growth and challenges. His voice was grave as he told me he disagreed completely with Richard's decision to terminate me. Harold revealed something shocking. During my absence, Richard had asked him to adjust the third quarter financial reports to hide a $50 million loss from a failed investment that Sophia had championed. It was a retail chain acquisition that I had strongly opposed in writing, warning that their financials were suspicious and their market position was deteriorating. Sophia had convinced Richard to proceed anyway, and now the chain was heading toward bankruptcy. Richard wanted to bury the loss until after year-end bonuses were distributed, particularly the massive bonus he had promised Sophia. I asked Harold to document everything he could without putting himself at risk. He agreed, mentioning that he was only 2 years from retirement and had already consulted his lawyer about whistleblower protections. He promised to quietly gather evidence and forward it to my personal email through encrypted channels. Before hanging up, he said something that gave me hope. He was not the only senior executive questioning Richard's recent decisions. There was growing unrest in the upper management ranks. Jennifer called me an hour later with urgent news. She had overheard Sophia on a conference call with someone from Apex Corp, our biggest competitor. Sophia was discussing detailed information about our client relationships, upcoming bids, and strategic plans for the next year. Jennifer managed to record part of the conversation on her phone before having to leave to avoid suspicion. The recording was poor quality, but you could clearly hear Sophia promising to provide more information in exchange for a future position at Apex if things at Thompson Industries did not work out. This was corporate espionage, plain and simple. Sophia was not just incompetent, she was actively sabotaging Thompson Industries while enriching herself. I immediately contacted my lawyer in Connecticut, Sarah Blackwood, who specialized in corporate law and had handled several high-profile cases involving executive misconduct. Sarah listened to everything I had gathered so far and confirmed that we had the beginnings of a strong case, but we needed more concrete evidence to present to the board. That afternoon, I received an unexpected call from Patricia Chen, one of the most influential members of the board of directors. Patricia had built her own technology company from scratch and sold it for $500 million before joining Thompson Industries' board 5 years ago. She had always been supportive of my work and was furious about my termination. She revealed that Richard had not consulted the board before firing me, a violation of corporate governance protocols for C-level executives. Patricia had already spoken with 3 other board members who shared her concerns. They were particularly worried about several major clients threatening to leave if I was not reinstated. She mentioned that the board had the power to call an emergency meeting if 5 members requested it, and she was close to having the necessary support. She asked me to prepare a comprehensive presentation about the real situation at Thompson Industries, including any evidence of misconduct I might have discovered. I spent the rest of that day working with Patricia's recommended private investigator, a former FBI agent named Michael Torres. Within hours, Michael uncovered information about Sophia that exceeded our worst suspicions. Not only were her credentials fake, but she was married to a man in California who had a criminal record for fraud. She had been using a slightly different version of her name at Thompson Industries, and her husband was fully aware of her relationship with Richard, seeing it as a long con to extract money from a wealthy older man. Michael provided photographs, marriage certificates, and even text messages between Sophia and her husband, discussing their plan to milk Richard for as much as possible before disappearing. One message literally used those exact words, referring to Richard as the old fool who was easier to manipulate than they had expected. They discussed transferring money to offshore accounts and mentioned having done similar schemes before with other executives. This was not Sophia's first time running this type of con. The evidence was damning, but I needed to be strategic about how to use it. Simply sending it to Richard would likely result in him covering it up to save face. I needed to present it in a forum where he could not control the narrative. Patricia suggested waiting until the emergency board meeting where all the evidence could be presented at once, making it impossible for Richard to spin or suppress. The board meeting was scheduled for 5 days later, giving me just enough time to return from Hawaii and prepare. That evening, Mark and I sat on our hotel balcony watching the sunset over the Pacific. He held my hand as I outlined my plan to not just get my job back, but to protect Thompson Industries from those who would destroy it. Mark was finally seeing his father, clearly recognizing how power and infatuation had corrupted the man he once idolized. He promised to stand by me, even if it meant permanent estrangement from his father. For the first time since receiving that termination email, I felt like I was not fighting alone. Over the next 2 days, still in Hawaii, I conducted a series of video conferences that would determine the future of Thompson Industries. Each call was carefully scheduled to build a coalition of support before the emergency board meeting. I started with the 5 board members Patricia had identified as sympathetic to my situation. These were not just casual conversations. They were strategic presentations designed to show the real state of the company under Richard's recent leadership. I began with David Sterling, a venture capitalist who had joined the board 3 years ago. David was data-driven and respected measurable results above all else. I showed him detailed analytics, comparing the performance of the M&A department before and after my arrival. The numbers were undeniable: a 400% increase in successful acquisitions, a 60% reduction in due diligence time, and most importantly, a return on investment that exceeded industry standards by 200%. When I showed him projections of what would happen if my key clients left, his expression grew increasingly concerned. Next was Eleanor Hartman, a former Fortune 500 CEO who had turned around 3 failing companies during her career. Eleanor understood corporate politics better than anyone and immediately grasped the implications of Richard's behavior. She was particularly disturbed by the evidence of financial manipulation that Harold had uncovered. Eleanor had seen too many companies destroyed by executives who put personal interests above fiduciary duty. She assured me of her support and offered to speak with 2 other board members who respected her opinion. The third call was with Thomas Anderson, an investment banker who had initially been skeptical of my appointment 5 years ago, but had become one of my strongest supporters after seeing my results. Thomas was furious when I explained how Sophia was sharing confidential information with competitors. He calculated that the intelligence Sophia had already leaked could cost Thomson Industries at least $100 million in lost contracts over the next year. Thomas promised not only to support me, but to demand a full investigation into the security breach. By the end of the second day, I had secured 7 of the 9 board members' support. The only holdouts were Richard himself and his longtime golf buddy, William Prescott. But 7 votes were more than enough to override Richard's decisions and potentially remove him as CEO if necessary. Patricia began drafting the formal agenda for the emergency meeting, ensuring that my presentation would be the primary focus. While I was building board support, James Morrison from Morrison Corp took matters into his own hands. He sent a formal letter to the board, copying Richard, stating that Morrison Corp would terminate their $200 million annual contract if I was not reinstated within 7 days. Furthermore, he mentioned that he had discussed the situation with other major clients who were prepared to take similar action. The letter was professional but devastating, making it clear that Richard's personal decisions were threatening the company's core revenue. Within hours of Morrison's letter, 2 more major clients followed suit. Phoenix Group, our second largest client, expressed serious concerns about continuity and competence in the M&A department. Stellar Tech went even further, stating they had already begun exploring partnerships with our competitors, given the instability at Thomson Industries. The board members who had been on the fence now had no choice but to act. The company was facing potential losses of over $500 million in annual revenue. Mark received a call from his mother during this chaos. Margaret had been contacted by several board members seeking her input given her 25% stake in the company from the divorce settlement. Margaret made it clear that she supported me completely and would use her voting power accordingly. She also revealed that she had hired a forensic accountant to review Richard's recent financial decisions, suspecting he had been using company funds inappropriately to support Sophia's lavish lifestyle. The forensic accountant's preliminary findings were staggering. Richard had authorized over $2 million in questionable expenses over the past 6 months. First-class trips to Paris and Milan allegedly for business, but actually vacations with Sophia, a company apartment that only Sophia is. A corporate credit card with charges at luxury boutiques and jewelry stores and consulting fees paid to Sophia's friends who had never actually provided any services. This was not just poor judgment, it was embezzlement. As if the situation could not get worse for Richard Michael Torres, the private investigator uncovered the final piece of damning evidence. He found records of Sophia and her husband's previous victims, 3 other executives who had been similarly conned over the past 5 years. One had committed suicide after losing everything, another was in federal prison for crimes he committed trying to cover up the money he had stolen for Sophia, and the third had fled the country to avoid prosecution. Michael compiled this into a report that painted Sophia not just as an opportunist, but as a serial predator. On our last night in Hawaii, Mark and I walked along the beach where this nightmare had begun just days earlier. The vacation that was supposed to celebrate our marriage had become a battleground for the future of his family's company. But something had changed between us through this crisis. The trust issues and communication problems that had allowed his father to manipulate us were gone, replaced by a partnership forged in adversity. Mark looked at me as we watched the waves and said something I will never forget, that I was not just fighting for my job, but for the soul of Thompson Industries, and he had never been prouder to call me his wife. The next morning we flew back to Connecticut. The emergency board meeting was in 48 hours. Jennifer had secretly coordinated with my former team, and 12 of them had signed a letter stating they would resign immediately if I was not reinstated. These were not entry-level employees, but senior managers who handled our most complex deals. Their departure would essentially destroy the M&A department that generated 30% of Thompson Industries' profits. Richard had no idea that his actions had triggered a full revolt among his most valuable employees. I spent the flight refining my presentation, organizing the evidence into a narrative that would be impossible to ignore or refute. 50 slides that told the story of corruption, deception, and betrayal at the highest level of Thompson Industries. But more than that, it was a roadmap for saving the company from those who would destroy it for personal gain. Each slide was designed to build upon the previous one, creating an overwhelming case that would leave the board with only one possible course of action. The morning of the emergency board meeting, I woke at 4:30, unable to sleep any longer. Mark was already awake, staring at the ceiling of our bedroom. We had not spoken to Richard since that horrible phone call from Hawaii, and Mark's attempts to reach his father had gone unanswered. The man who had been such a dominant force in our lives had become a stranger, consumed by his infatuation with a woman who was systematically destroying everything he had built. I dressed carefully in my best navy suit, the one I had worn when I closed the biggest deal in company history. Jennifer had arranged for my former team to be present in the building, ready to show their support if needed. Harold Watson had confirmed he would present the true financial statements, despite Richard's explicit orders to keep them hidden. Patricia Chen had ensured that security would be present, anticipating that Richard might try to prevent me from entering the boardroom. The Thompson Industries headquarters was a gleaming 40-story tower in downtown Hartford, a monument to 3 generations of business success. As our car pulled up to the building, I saw something that made my heart swell. Dozens of employees were standing outside, having heard about the meeting through the company grapevine. They began applauding as I stepped out of the car, some holding signs that said, "We stand with Lauren," and "Save our company." These were people whose livelihoods depended on stable, ethical leadership, and they were counting on me to fight for them. The boardroom was on the top floor with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the city. As I entered, Richard was already there, sitting at the head of the massive oak table that had belonged to his father. Sophia sat to his right, wearing a bright red suit that seemed designed to project power she had not earned. She looked at me with undisguised contempt, apparently confident that her position was secure. Richard would not make eye contact, instead studying papers in front of him with artificial intensity. The other board members filed in, their expressions ranging from concerned to outright hostile toward Richard. Patricia took her seat and immediately called the meeting to order, noting that this emergency session had been called due to serious concerns about corporate governance and fiduciary responsibility. Richard tried to object, claiming the meeting was invalid, but Patricia calmly reminded him that the bylaws were clear. 5 board members could call an emergency meeting and 7 had requested this one. I was given the floor first, and I connected my laptop to the presentation system. The first slide appeared on the screen, showing a simple graph of M&A department performance over the past 5 years. My voice was steady as I began walking the board through my contributions to Thompson Industries. 15 slides showing revenue-generated deals, closed clients acquired, and teams built. The numbers were irrefutable, each one representing countless hours of work and dedication to making Thompson Industries successful. When I reached slide 16, the room's atmosphere changed. I began presenting the evidence of financial irregularities that had occurred since Sophia's arrival. The $50 million loss from her failed retail acquisition, hidden through accounting manipulation. The $2 million in personal expenses charged to the company. The consulting fees paid to her friends for non-existent services. Harold Watson confirmed each number, adding that he had documentation for everything and had already contacted the SEC about his concerns. Slide 31 began the most damaging section of my presentation. I showed the evidence of Sophia sharing confidential information with Apex Corp. Jennifer's recording played through the speakers, Sophia's voice clearly discussing our client strategies with our biggest competitor. Thomas Anderson, the investment banker on the board, stood up in rage, shouting that this was corporate treason. Security moved closer to Sophia, who had gone pale and was whispering urgently to Richard. But the worst was yet to come. Slides 41 through 45 revealed Sophia's true identity. Her fake MBA, her hidden marriage, her husband's criminal record, and most devastatingly, the text messages between her and her husband discussing their plan to con Richard. I read one message aloud where Sophia called Richard pathetic and said she could barely stand to touch him, but would endure it for the money. Richard's face went from red to white as he realized the woman he had destroyed his family for saw him as nothing but a mark. Slide 46 showed the 3 previous executives Sophia and her husband had targeted. I described each case, emphasizing the executive who had taken his own life after losing everything. Eleanor Hartman asked Sophia directly if she denied any of these allegations. Sophia stood up, grabbed her purse, and tried to leave the room. Security blocked her path on Patricia's orders, forcing her to return to her seat. She was trapped, her con finally exposed, with nowhere to run. Richard finally found his voice standing and pounding the table, accusing me of fabricating evidence out of spite. He threatened to sue me, the board, and anyone else who believed these lies about Sophia. But his protests rang hollow as Harold presented the forensic accounting report, showing Richard had personally transferred $20 million from a company development fund into an account only he and Sophia could access. This was not just poor judgment, it was embezzlement on a massive scale. Patricia called for a vote of no confidence in Richard's leadership. The motion was seconded immediately by 3 different board members. Richard tried to claim such a vote was invalid, that as CEO and chairman he had certain protections. But Thomas Anderson, who had studied the bylaws, thoroughly pointed out that embezzlement and breach of fiduciary duty nullified those protections. The vote was called, and one by one board members raised their hands. 7 votes for removal, only William Prescott, supporting Richard, and Richard unable to vote on his own removal. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Security was instructed to escort Richard from the building immediately, with his access revoked, pending a full investigation. Sophia tried to follow him, but Patricia informed her that the police had been called and were waiting downstairs to question her about corporate espionage and fraud. The woman who had seemed so confident just an hour earlier was now facing potential federal charges. As Richard was led out, he turned to look at Mark and me. For a moment, I saw not the tyrannical CEO who had betrayed me, but a broken old man who had lost everything for an illusion. Mark stepped forward as if to say something to his father, but Richard turned away, unable to face the son he had betrayed along with everyone else. It was the last time we would see him in that building his father had built. The board immediately voted to reinstate me as head of mergers and acquisitions, with a promotion to chief operating officer and double my previous salary. They also approved a full audit of all financial decisions made in the past 6 months, and authorized cooperation with law enforcement regarding both Richard and Sophia's actions. The meeting that Richard had thought would rubber stamp his decisions had instead ended his career and exposed his complete moral failure. The immediate aftermath of the board meeting was chaotic but cathartic. News of Richard's removal spread through the building within minutes, and by the time I reached my old office, now Sophia's former office, my entire team was there waiting. Jennifer had tears streaming down her face as she handed me the nameplate that had been on my desk, which she had saved from the trash where Sophia had thrown it. One by one, my team members expressed their relief and commitment to rebuilding what had been damaged during my absence. Within an hour, I was on conference calls with our major clients. James Morrison was the first to respond, not only confirming Morrison Corp would maintain their contract, but expanding it by an additional $100 million annually. He said my handling of the situation had demonstrated the kind of leadership and integrity he wanted in a business partner. Phoenix Group and Stellar Tech similarly confirmed their continued partnerships with both CEOs, expressing admiration for how I had protected the company's interests despite personal attacks. The police arrived that afternoon to arrest Sophia at the airport. She had tried to flee immediately after the board meeting, but Patricia had anticipated this and alerted law enforcement. Sophia was charged with corporate espionage, fraud, and embezzlement as an accomplice. Her husband was arrested simultaneously in California, and their scheme finally came to an end. During her arrest, police found she was carrying flash drives with confidential Thompson Industries data she intended to sell to competitors. Richard's downfall was even more complete. As the forensic accountants dug deeper, they discovered he had taken nearly $30 million from various company accounts to fund his relationship with Sophia. He had mortgaged his family estate, without Margaret's knowledge, taken personal loans against his company stock, and even borrowed from his own retirement fund. When Sophia's true nature was revealed, he tried to recover the $5 million he had already transferred to her personal accounts, only to discover she had moved it offshore beyond his reach. Mark struggled with the revelation of his father's complete moral collapse. He spent hours on the phone with his brother in California, trying to make sense of how the man who had taught them about integrity and hard work had fallen so far. Margaret, however, was not surprised. She revealed that Richard had always had a weakness for flattery and had grown increasingly narcissistic as his wealth and power increased. Sophia had simply known exactly which buttons to push to exploit those weaknesses. The company transformation began immediately. As COO, I implemented new governance policies to prevent any single executive from having the unchecked power Richard had abused. We established an ethics committee, mandatory financial transparency protocols, and a whistleblower protection program that would have caught Richard's embezzlement months earlier. The board unanimously approved every measure determined to restore Thompson Industries' reputation. My team and I worked 18-hour days to repair the damage Sophia had caused with clients. We had to renegotiate several deals she had bungled, restore relationships she had poisoned with her incompetence, and assure everyone that Thompson Industries was stable and trustworthy again. Within 3 months, we had not only recovered our position, but actually expanded our client base by 20%, as companies that had been watching our handling of the crisis decided we were a firm they could trust. The legal proceedings against Richard and Sophia dominated business news for weeks. The trial revealed even more victims of Sophia's previous cons, and she was eventually sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for her crimes. Her husband received 20 years as the mastermind of their schemes. Richard avoided prison through a plea deal that required him to pay back everything he had stolen, plus massive fines that essentially wiped out his personal wealth. He was also banned from serving as an executive or board member of any public company for life. 6 months after that horrible day in Hawaii, Thompson Industries held its annual shareholders meeting. As the new CEO, a position the board had unanimously offered me, I stood before hundreds of investors and employees to present our recovery and future plans. Our stock price had not only recovered from the scandal, but reached record highs. We had secured $3 billion in new contracts, expanded into 2 new markets, and been recognized by Forbes as one of the best managed companies in America. The transformation was remarkable, but it came with personal costs. Richard sold everything to pay his fines and restitution, moving into a small apartment in Florida, where he lived alone, estranged from his entire family. Mark and his brother tried to reach out several times, but Richard refused all contact, unable to face the shame of what he had done. Margaret, on the other hand, flourished in her new independence, using her divorce settlement to start a foundation supporting women entrepreneurs. A year after the crisis, I received an unexpected letter forwarded from the company. It was from Richard, postmarked from Florida. In shaky handwriting, he apologized for everything he had done, admitted that his ego and foolishness had nearly destroyed his father's legacy, and thanked me for saving the company from his mistakes. He said he spent his days now thinking about all the people he had hurt and wished he could undo the damage. Mark and I read it together, and while we chose to forgive him for our own peace, we knew our relationship with him could never be repaired. The success of Thompson Industries under my leadership became a Harvard Business School case study on crisis management and ethical leadership. I was invited to speak at conferences about how to build resilient corporate cultures that could withstand executive malfeasance. But I always emphasized that the real credit belonged to the employees who stood up for what was right, the board members who chose integrity over comfort, and the clients who gave us a second chance. Looking back now, 2 years after that devastating email in Hawaii, I can see how that betrayal became the catalyst for something far greater than personal vindication. The pain of being fired by someone I had trusted who had called me daughter while plotting my destruction taught me invaluable lessons about strength, resilience, and the importance of building alliances based on genuine respect rather than mere convenience or family ties. The relationship with Mark emerged from this crisis stronger than ever. We had both been naive about his father choosing to ignore red flags because we wanted to believe in the man Richard pretended to be. The therapy we entered after the crisis helped us develop communication patterns that made us true partners. We learned to trust each other's instincts, to speak up when something felt wrong, and most importantly, to present a united front against anyone who would try to manipulate or divide us. Our marriage became a source of strength rather than vulnerability. What surprised me most was the relationship that developed with Margaret. My former mother-in-law became my closest advisor and confidant. She had built her own successful career before marrying Richard, and her insights into business and leadership proved invaluable. She joined the Thompson Industries board and became known for asking the tough questions that kept us honest and focused. Margaret often said that losing her marriage had been painful, but watching me transform the company into something better than Richard ever imagined was worth every tear she had shed. Thompson Industries underwent a complete cultural transformation under my leadership. We changed the name to Phoenix Industries, symbolizing our rise from the ashes of scandal and corruption. The company became known not just for financial success, but for ethical business practices and treatment of employees. We implemented profit-sharing programs, established mentorship initiatives for young professionals, and created a work environment where integrity was valued above all else. The company Richard had ruled through fear and favoritism became a place where talent and hard work were genuinely rewarded. The lessons from this experience extend far beyond corporate governance. I learnt that sometimes the people who claim to support you the most are the ones plotting your downfall, that credentials and appearances mean nothing compared to character and actual competence, that when someone shows you who they really are through their actions, you must believe them regardless of their words or your history together. And perhaps most importantly, that standing up for yourself and your principles, even when it seems impossible, can inspire others to do the same. The story spread throughout the business world, becoming a cautionary tale about the dangers of nepotism and unchecked power. Several companies reached out to me for consultation when they faced similar situations with corrupt leadership. I always told them the same thing: document everything, build your coalition carefully, and never underestimate the power of truth presented at the right moment to the right audience. But I also warned them that victory would come with costs, that relationships would be permanently altered, and that they needed to be prepared for the full weight of those consequences. Richard's letter from Florida haunted me for months. Here was a man who had everything: wealth, family, respect, and had thrown it all away for a woman who saw him as nothing more than a wallet to be emptied. His fall from grace was so complete that even his oldest friends abandoned him. William Prescott, who had supported him in that final board vote, later admitted he knew Richard was wrong, but felt obligated by 40 years of friendship. That friendship ended the day the full extent of Richard's crimes became public. The impact on Mark's family was permanent, but not entirely negative. His brother James returned from California to join Phoenix Industries, bringing fresh perspectives from Silicon Valley that helped us expand into technology sectors. The family reunions that had once revolved around Richard's ego became genuine gatherings where everyone could speak freely. Margaret hosted them at her new home, a beautiful but modest house that felt more like a real home than the mansion ever had. We celebrated successes, supported each other through challenges, and built the kind of family relationships that should have existed all along. My journey from that beach in Hawaii to the CEO office taught me that power is not inherited or given through favoritism. Real power comes from the respect you earn through your actions, the alliances you build through genuine partnership, and the courage to stand up for what is right, even when everything seems stacked against you. Richard thought power came from his title and his money. Sophia thought power came from manipulation and exploitation. They both learned that such power is an illusion that crumbles at the first real challenge. The most satisfying moment came not from Richard's downfall or Sophia's imprisonment, but from an employee meeting 6 months after I became CEO. A young analyst stood up and said that for the first time in her 5 years at the company, she felt proud to work there. She said watching me fight for what was right had inspired her to stay and build her career with us, rather than accept an offer from a competitor. That one comment validated everything I had gone through, confirming that the fight had been about more than personal vindication. What would you have done in my position if the person you trusted most in your professional life betrayed you for someone who was obviously exploiting them? Would you have fought back or walked away? Have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace and standing up for what's right? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to hear more about triumph over betrayal. Share this with anyone who needs reminding that integrity and perseverance always win in the end. Thank you for listening to my journey, and remember, sometimes the worst betrayals lead to the greatest victories. Your comeback story might be just one courageous decision away.